terms of getting the private sector involved, show them a profit opportunity, and the private sector will generally follow you. I think the key is how well are we doing, and the answer is, in my view, not very well at all. I don't think the LEP has yet reached anything like its full potential. It looks more and more, and when you go around the country, you see this increasingly like a government-led proposition, and therefore, you know, to some degree, the private sector is just sort of watching and waiting before it commits too much. But if we look at some specifics, take, for example, the housing issue. I mean, the housing market is essentially a private sector funded proposition. The issue there is, and I'm very, very clear about this, is the planning system. Think about how any market works. You have a massive demand for a product. You have a mountain of money keen to fund that product, and yet, for some reason, supply is drying up, and you know, demand therefore pushes price even higher, making this city, in my view, a dreadful fortress, one which, if you live in it, you don't leave, and if you want to come into it, you simply can't afford to. So, you know, this is a huge structural issue for us, and the issue is the planning system. And just to put that in very, very simple terms, you know, I'm used to a situation where between applying for planning consent and, you know, making the first cut on site would take you on average about 6 months. Now it will take you about 2.5 years. And I mean, I welcome all the steps that are being taken structurally to, you know, make sure that we've got a decent sort of arrangement with utilities. But it's not utilities that are generally the problem. It's negotiations over Section 106. It's negotiations over mayoral sills or other local sills. It's negotiations over the proportion of affordable housing that can be tolerated by the scheme. There are many local authorities in London who seem to have a very odd view of an economy. I mean, you know, most property transactions are pretty transparent, actually. You know what somebody paid for the land. You know what it's going to cost them to build. All these figures are freely available. You know what they're going to sell for. It's all registered at the land registry. It's pretty easy to work out what kind of margin the developer is going to make, and therefore to assess what a reasonable proportion of social housing should be. This kind of obvious logic seems to have escaped an awful lot of London local authorities. And quite frankly, part of the reason for that is because there's far too much democracy around. It really is a complete pain. You know, we have a system. We have a system whereby, and this is actually, sadly, all too serious. You have a system whereby a few local residents will affect a few local councillors, who, of course, don't get re-elected unless they listen to these local residents, right or wrong. No matter whether they're right or wrong, the fact is that's where the pressure comes. And as a result, the council will either make very difficult or indeed just refuse applications which, if they really cared about housing London, they would approve. And so, you know, I'm a huge fan of what Ken Livingstone did towards the end of his time. He started off with the power in the Greater London Authority Act to refuse a consent by a local authority which was inconsistent with the London plan. But he lobbied for the right to approve an application which the local authority had refused, in his view, for a quixotic reason. You know, Ken famously said, that building's not tall enough. And what he was doing in the process, because I don't think he gave a damn whether they were tall or not, but what he recognized is that the taller the building, the more money the developer had from which he could screw more affordable housing. And I think that's a perfect, for an old trot, that's a wonderfully commercial view of the world. You know, broadly speaking, it worked. So get the planning system right. I think you have to give the mayor more pervasive powers. I think you need to lower the threshold at which the mayor can intervene, because at the moment I think it's too high. And in the course of that, have a relentless campaign to not only just bring the private sector is ready, willing, and able. It would love to do this, but also to make sure that government, for example, absolutely mandates that publicly owned land should effectively be controlled by the mayor. That the mayor should have the ability to dictate to Department of Defense, the National Health Service and others, where there is clearly unused land, that land is going to effectively be procured for housing purposes, because the housing problem is just, in my view, it's an appalling scar on the city. And incidentally, when you talk to business groups, I'm a member of London First, and I remember when we were last around a table talking about what we thought the great issues were for London. It wasn't high-speed broadband or, whether we'd got our visa policy right for bringing in more, high-tech practitioners. It was housing. You know, these guys who, you know, afford to pay huge amounts of money for their homes, they were saying it's housing for ordinary Londoners that is our biggest single issue. I think everything points to that's where the private sector wants to be. Government's got to allow it to be there.